My name is Helgi Steinar, stand-up comedian, independent journalist, and enthusiast of all things global. My documentaries have brought me to places like China, the British Isles, and even the radioactive ghost towns of Chernobyl. In my travels, I try to make sense of these places by talking to the locals, checking out their comedy scenes, and exploring the diverse cultures that shape the very world we live in today. On this episode of Unplugged Borders, we visit a country that is currently gripped in the midst of chaos, turmoil, and political uncertainty. A country that has so far suffered over 180,000 COVID deaths, while the very scientists and health professionals trying to help have either been ignored or politicized. A country whose very democratic system of governance is being brought into question as it debates whether or not it will see a peaceful transition of power during its upcoming election. A country that I called home for 13 years. Now, for those of you familiar with my work or have seen these shows before, you'll know that I keep saying I'm 100% Icelandic. However, I do also say that with a very distinct American accent.
Rabbits and rabbits?
Oh, Tranigans and the Kurgles and the Frackenson Nation.
When I was about 2 years old, I moved to the United States with my parents. My dad wanted to become an actor and my mom was studying at university. Now, a few years later, my parents divorced and they decided to split custody. My mom stayed in the US and my dad moved back to Iceland, which meant that I would spend the next 2 decades flying back and forth in order to see the both of them, growing up simultaneously on 2 different continents. Now, even though I wasn't born there, I've always felt a personal connection to the United States, which is why it really pains me to see what's currently going on there. I mean, from the looks of it, it seems like America just ran out of countries to invade and decided to go ahead and invade itself. Of course, the United States obviously has a long way to go in order to better itself, but that's not what this episode is going to be all about. I want to try and explain why America, and especially places like the Midwest, is the way it is. I think we often tend to forget that in many ways the United States still has a lot of that Wild West DNA ingrained in its very psyche. It may have advanced technologically, but it really shouldn't be that surprising that a country like America, that was born out of the barrel of a gun in 1776 and spent the next 2 centuries in a violent melting pot of expansionism, should end up being this divided. Now, to understand this side of America better, I went back to visit my old hometown where I grew up, played baseball, and graduated high school. Welcome to Northfield, Minnesota. This sleepy little town on the banks of the Cannon River, located in the north midwestern part of the United States, is what many would consider to be a small town paradise. From the lush green college campuses of both St. Olaf and Carleton to the highly prosperous Malto Meal cereal factory just a few miles down the road. But education and economic wealth aren't the only things that characterize Northfield. This town also played a very significant role in the early days of American history. Now, at the end of the Civil War, many parts of the American South had been left completely destroyed. With no job opportunities and a lot of resentment towards the North, former soldiers of the Confederacy began finding more sinister ways of making money. One of those soldiers turned bank robbers was the outlaw Jesse James. Now, in his eyes, the Civil War never really ended, and the banks that he robbed were not just a means of enriching himself and his gang, but were also meant to deal an economic blow to Northern authority. Now, 1876 was a very big year for American history. The country was celebrating its 100th year anniversary of independence. General Custer met a very, very gruesome death at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And on September 7th, just outside this First National Bank here, bank robber Jesse James and his gang of misfit outlaws attempted, as they had done so many times successfully before, to rob the bank. However, this time it went quite south. The local townspeople quickly got wind of what was happening and went home to arm themselves and began firing on the bank robbers. 7 minutes after the raid began, 2 of the members of the Jesse James gang lay dead in the streets, with the remaining 6 fleeing town on their horses.
Meanwhile, out on the street, the James Younger gang were facing something altogether new. A town fighting back. J.S. Allen was back in his hardware store and passing out rifles.
Back in Missouri, these are the James boys everybody hid. In Northfield, Minnesota, they didn't hide. They got out their carbines and shotguns and started shooting.
Now, what's surprising about the whole Jesse James raid is just how popular this story has become. I mean, the entire town of Northfield's identity is circled around this one event, with reenactments and festivals taking place every year. But why? I mean, the Old West had plenty of bank and stagecoach robberies taking place all the time. What made this one so different? I think the reason is that this very event feeds into the very ethos that is America. It's a simple story that explains very clearly who the bad guys are and who the good guys are. The good guys are just minding their own business when all of a sudden they're forced into a situation where they have to grab their guns and defend their town. They exchange gunshots, and then in the end, all the bad guys are either dead or defeated. I mean, it's a story that reads almost like porn fiction to the NRA, and is probably what a lot of gun nuts think they would do in a similar situation. Look, the simple fact is that there are just a lot of Americans armed with guns and a hero complex, and if the action you're looking for isn't taking place in your hometown, well, then you might as well hop in your pickup truck and seek it somewhere else.
Chased down the road. A gunman stumbles before the mob attacks, and he opens fire. Moments earlier, he'd been pursued by several others. Something is thrown at him before he turns and shoots. This is the 17-year-old who's been arrested. He'd come from interstate, claiming he was there to help.
And our job is to protect this business, and part of my job is to also help people.
He was just one of a number of self-described militia members who descended on Kenosha during a third night of rioting, apparently fed up with the destruction of private property.
Look, I'm not going to get too much into this. Whether this kid was acting in self-defense at that very moment, or if he was just some Wyatt Earp wannabe looking for a target, I think the more interesting thing to point out is, why is a 17-year-old kid appointing himself to be an armed vigilante? I mean, he wasn't trained for crowd control or de-escalation tactics, he just kind of showed up with a gun. And I think that's what worries me most about the current trend in the United States. I mean, the country is just as, if not more, divided now than during the Civil War, and these pockets of violence that have been taking place over the last few months seem to be happening a lot more frequently. I mean, sure, America is still technically united, but historically that hasn't always been enough to save a polarized country.
In 1990, the Federation of 6 republics that made up Yugoslavia was still united. But with the collapse of communism, the 2 major republics, Serbia and Croatia, fell under the sway of rival nationalisms. Serbia's president, Slobodan Milosevic, had been the first to inflame his people. The Serb threat provoked the people of neighboring Croatia to respond. In their first free elections, they chose the nationalist, Franjo Tudjman, as their president.
Now, the breakup of Yugoslavia and subsequent wars didn't happen on its own. It was fueled by hatred and distrust, and in the end, that was enough to light the powder keg. Now, of course, it would be a bit dramatic for me to say America is at a similar point right now, but the country is not exactly in a good place either. Black Americans obviously don't trust the police because, well, they keep getting killed by them, and militia types now think that they need to take the law into their own hands. Political dialogue has been replaced by hatred and screaming, with the majority of the populace getting their information not from trusted news sources, but from online echo chambers that do nothing more than reinforce their current belief system. Which is another societal element that highlights the failures of the American education system that often lacks the very resources to help the students who may need it the most.
This is Alexander Learning Center in Faribault. And on this side is where the little kids, developmentally disabled, so autistic, not doing real well in school. These are the front doors, go through their security system. As you can see, so you got to get buzzed in through this door, and then you got to go through these doors. You can see some of the teachers' offices. There are two groups of older kids in here. For the developmentally disabled who are not able to function well in school, they have a very small section for them. And then the others are kids who've been kicked out of school for disciplinary reasons. They've gotten into fights, they've been caught with drugs in their locker, that type of thing. The school has regular classrooms, it's got a gymnasium, it's got an art room, it's got a play area in the back. I'm not sure what the building was originally. It's been adapted, I think. I don't think it was built as an educational facility. So
It's windowless, right?
they've cut windows into it, but when you're inside, in some of the areas, you don't really see the outside. I don't know if it's a security thing, but the windows are all bolted shut. You can tell, because I assume they would be passing drugs and stuff through it. And the kids are usually here just for limited periods of time. And then when there's suspension, a lot of these kids have been suspended from school, but they still have to go to school. So they get a 2-month suspension. They're here for 2 months, and then they'll go back to the high school.
Ultimately, what has always held the United States together has been that very concept of the American dream. But like the comedian George Carlin once said, it's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe in it. Now for many, that dream was just a drunken party, and now those very people are waking up to a bitter hangover. Even before COVID-19, Americans were suffering from inequality, divisiveness, lack of basic healthcare, and just a general feeling of hopelessness. Around 60% of Americans say they live paycheck to paycheck, and that's just the folks who have a job. What many Americans are now left with are a lot of guns and a lot of anger, a combination that I believe, if left unchecked, could spell the end of the American experiment. So what's the solution? Stricter gun laws, buyback program, much like Australia did after the Port Arthur massacre, or maybe just a change in cultural mindsets? Who knows? I mean, a country can only change if it really, really wants to, and at the moment, what America really seems to want is to hold on to its guns. But maybe there are no perfect solutions, but like the writer Voltaire once said, never let perfect become the enemy of the necessary.